Welcome to the latest episode of the Reach Prevention of Targeted Violence podcast. Join us as we explore different aspects of violence prevention through insightful discussions with community partners and experts. I'm Andy Martinez, your host and a team member for the Reach Project. I'm delighted to be here with you today. The topic of our discussion is working with the school community. Involving the school community in violence prevention initiatives is vital for creating a safe learning environment where youths can thrive. By working together with educators, administrators, and families, we can identify early warning signs and provide support services to address underlying issues that contribute to violence. Through proactive communication and intervention, we can create a nurturing environment that equips youths with the skills and resources they need to build healthy relationships. Joining us today is Dr. Leticia Villarreal-Sosa. Dr. Villarreal-Sosa is an associate professor and associate dean for research and faculty development at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, Texas. Dr. Villarreal-Sosa, thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your areas of specialty?
Yes, thank you, Andy. It's wonderful to be here with you and the audience today. My area of specialty focuses on school social work. And in particular, I've been doing a lot of work related to immigrant youth and related to equity practices in the schools.
Thank you. To start today's episode, what are the most common forms of violence you think are witnessed or reported within schools?
I think the current political climate has really increased the level of bullying, particularly for certain populations of students. So I think, especially post the Trump election, we saw an increase in bullying towards Arab American Muslim youth, towards immigrant youth, LGBTQ youth. So it was as if this time period sort of opened up this permission almost, right, for this kind of bullying to occur. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. It wasn't just peer to peer, but sometimes it was also teacher to student type of bullying around different sort of minoritized identities, but particularly those that were targeted in the larger sort of political climate and context. And so I think those were particularly challenging. And of course, the groups that were the most targeted at that time, right, were immigrant youth and also Muslim Arab American youth during that time period with the Muslim ban and those kinds of things. So I think whatever is happening around us, right, politically, often you see that really translate into the type of bullying and the type of violence that you see in the schools. And I think, and certain populations, of course, always have had higher incidences of bullying or being targeted. So, for example, LGBTQ youth, trans youth, for example, are groups that often experience different types of violence. And the violence, I think, when I think about violence for these groups too, it can be direct bullying that we think of, right, with direct kind of harassment or targeting, either verbally or physically even at times. But I also think about the psychological violence that youth experience given these contextual issues that they face, right, that affect people like them. So, for example, when you have an anti-immigrant climate, it affects all immigrant youth or all Latino youth, even if they may not be immigrants themselves, because they're targeted as a racialized group through these anti-immigrant xenophobic narratives.
Thank you for sharing. From your perspective, what are the primary factors contributing to communication breakdown in school-based initiatives aimed at preventing and reducing violence?
One of the first things that comes to mind is I've done a little bit of work in thinking about issues of collaboration within school context, right? And so sometimes the systems themselves don't create the space for interdisciplinary collaboration and therefore communication, right? To really address these kinds of things. I think that in situations where I've seen it work well, it's been very intentional. Different interdisciplinary teams really come together. There's clarity about people's roles. There aren't concerns about sort of stepping on people's toes, and people can really engage in open dialogue about what what is my role? What is your role? What's the role of a school social worker? What's the role of a school psychologist? How do we fit together in addressing these types of issues? So I think there's some things that have to do with power dynamics and role definition and those kinds of things, but then also the structure of the school. So for example, things like where our office is located. Are people sort of in close proximity so that it facilitates communication? Are there common time periods when people can come together? Does the school create spaces when faculty can come together for professional development or just common planning periods so that it fosters that kind of collaboration? Some schools have done small learning communities models, right, where teachers and school-based mental health professionals maybe come together for common meetings. You have the English teacher, social studies teacher, all the different sort of disciplines come together with the school-based mental health folks to kind of problem solve and have communication around what the teachers may be seeing, right? Because the teachers really are on the front line in many ways, right? They're the ones that know best what the students' needs might be. So that communication is really important. And then I think also creating space for that communication with administration as well. So I always tell school-based professionals, particularly school social workers, right? You want to be at that table. We have a lot of skills that can really be leveraged in fostering communication, right? In building systems that are responsive to students' needs and addressing things like violence in schools. We need to be at those tables. And so that means that they need to feel empowered and take the initiative to also form those kinds of relationships with administrators, with principals, right? With other folks in the school and really be present in those ways as well. And be at the table, whether you're invited or not, right? So that people learn what the skills are that we bring to the table as social workers as well.
Thank you for your contribution. What are some strategies for creating a positive and inclusive classroom environment where all students feel valued and respected?
There's a lot of literature on what creates a positive and inclusive classroom environment. I'm actually going to start with the teacher, right, or the practitioner themselves in terms of that self-awareness, understanding your own positionality, understanding your own blind spots. I think often in school, whether you're a social worker, a mental health practitioner, a teacher, a lot of what we learn is sort of based on mainstream curriculum, right? Often not considering the lived experiences, particularly of minoritized or racialized youth. And so I think it's important to understand what we bring to the classroom. What are these sort of quote unquote evidence-based interventions? And do they really consider the lived experiences of minoritized youth, or do they consider their culture? Again, what are your own sort of blind spots? So I think that's the first thing, is you start with yourself. The second thing would be you are very intentional about bringing in curriculum and content that is relevant to the lives of youth, right? To their lived experience, their history, their culture. In social work, with school social workers in particular, I always say ethnic studies is actually an evidence-based practice for social workers, because ethnic studies, so incorporating content about students' own background, their own historical experience, that actually contributes to higher levels of engagement. Students are more likely to finish, to complete school, have lower absences, have higher grades, right? So there's a lot of really good outcomes as a result of having curriculum that is inclusive. And in my own work with youth and research that I've done, when I've interviewed youth, for example, youth are very smart and they know when things are superficial. And often in interviews that I did with one particular group of youth who were transitioning from 8th grade to high school, and I was asking them about their experiences, and they would say things like, yeah, Hispanic Heritage Month is nice, whatever, but we want more substance, right? They understand that these things are just superficial. Some of these cultural things or food things are kind of superficial. What they really wanted to see is their histories and their lived experiences reflected in the curriculum in the classrooms, right? So they want more depth in terms of what they have exposure to. So curriculum is important. And then the other thing I would say would be policies and practices that foster an inclusive classroom. And that means paying attention to different learning styles, thinking about your even just policies, what you might state as what are some things that you might do in terms of fostering an inclusive classroom and being very explicit about those types of policies and practices in your classroom.
Thank you for your input. Do you have any practical techniques for promoting student engagement and participation in classroom activities that support the diverse needs of the students?
For practical techniques, I would say First of all, again, having things that are relevant to students and their lives, things that they can connect with. So having a culturally responsive curriculum, because that's one way that you engage students when they see that who they are is reflected in the classroom. Also thinking, as I mentioned before, thinking about different learning strategies. So understanding. So for example, our culture in the US is very individualistic. It's often competitive, right? And for some cultures and groups of students, they come from cultures and backgrounds where they do better with more group and collaborative types of learning activities and learning styles, right? So I think those things. And then even if educators consider, again, just different learning styles and different ways to engage students. And I think there's a lot of good work in education, right, around those areas in terms of thinking about how we teach and what are some different ways that we can structure a classroom with different types of learning activities that address different learning styles. And that's one of the things that I took from my K through 12 experience working, because I worked many years as a school social worker in the public school system, mostly at the high school level, but I did work as well from preschool through high school as well. So all ages. I took a lot of what I learned about how you structure classrooms and thinking about different learning techniques, even into my higher ed setting when I moved into the university, right? Because there are a lot of really, for example, if you have a 90-minute class, right? So we know that having block scheduling, for example, is good because it creates space for fostering relationships and things like that versus the 45-minute sort of traditional high school classes, right? But if you have 90-minute block of time, you need to do at least 3 different activities that address 3 different learning styles within that 90-minute block. And so those kinds of strategies, I think, are really important. And making sure that you feel safe in your classroom and paying attention to who's participating and offering different ways of participation as well.
Now we're going to switch gears. Can you tell us what some of the strategies are for addressing bullying and promoting a culture of respect and empathy within school communities?
Absolutely. I think that one of the most important things you can do is really on the systemic level, right? So I think some of the work when I worked in the schools, right? Some of the things that we did were really focused on system level policies. So for example, starting with developing anti-bullying sort of policies and practices at the school level. So you want to analyze what are your current policies in your school? How do you address these kinds of things? Incorporating potentially restorative practices. We had even like peer mediators as well for certain situations where that might be appropriate. So system level policies are important. The other piece of it then is also making sure that you do a lot of professional development with teachers. Because one thing that I saw in the schools is that often teachers didn't intervene when they saw these things. And we assume, right, that somebody in the role of a teacher would have the skills to be able to interrupt those kinds of situations. And often they didn't. So we would do work with the teachers in terms of also doing professional development with them so that they increased their toolbox of how to interrupt and to understand what their responsibility is in terms of interrupting situations where they might see these things and what kind of skills and what kinds of things could they do to address those things. And that's part of the school-wide policy too, right? So anti-bullying strategies need to include those pieces as well. The other thing that you really have to do as well is sensitize the teachers to different populations and understand legally, like, what are their obligations. So I'll give you an example. I worked in a school where the community was somewhat conservative and a lot of teachers were from backgrounds where they struggled with accepting LGBTQ youth, right? And so with some people, it was just a matter of doing capacity building, helping them to understand the lived experiences of LGBTQ youth and what they might do to better support youth. For others, where maybe their beliefs, you weren't going to change those beliefs, but from those perspectives, then we could at least bring in maybe some lawyers who could talk about what's your legal obligation here in terms of protecting students. So I think thinking about what the needs are at your particular school and thinking about how you address those things. But I think with addressing those kinds of things and addressing violence, it really does need to be starting with at the systemic level and thinking about policies and practices in place and making sure that you're building capacity within the school for everyone to be able to have skills to address these kinds of things.
Let's discuss the roles that school administrators play. How can school administrators build a sense of community and belonging among students?
School administrators are leaders. Their presence is really important and their leadership is really important around addressing issues of equity, empowering other leaders within the schools and supporting the people who want to do that work, providing resources for that, whether the resources be either financial, right, with budgets for some of this work, but also even resources in terms of how things are structured, planning periods, et cetera. So I think that administrators play a really important role in showing up as leaders, right, in terms of modeling the behavior and showing their support for these things, as well as some of these actions and empowering other people on the ground who are doing the work.
Thank you for sharing. What proactive measures can schools take to create a safe and supportive environment that reduces the risk of violence among students?
I think we talked about a lot of these strategies already, right? I think analyzing your policies, developing system-wide policies, making sure that you have budgets for, I didn't mention this, right? But this is really key, that you have budgets for school-based mental health professionals, for school social workers, psychologists, counselors who are trained to support students and to implement some of these system-wide kind of initiatives and efforts, right, to address school violence. And community partnerships as well are really important, bringing in community resources to address these kinds of things, addressing school climate. I mean, assessment is really important, even just starting with assessment to just see what is the climate in this particular school. And then from there, understanding what might be some of the steps that you might take. So I think, again, just system-wide, it really has to be a system-wide effort to really consider the different ways that we support youth and that we create policies that foster inclusive environments in schools.
Additionally, what strategies do you think are most effective in engaging teachers, counselors, and administrators in violence prevention efforts?
That's a really good question, right? I think that's where leadership is really important. And that's where, and I noticed that you didn't mention social workers, right? You mentioned counselors, administrators, teachers. School social workers are critical for some of this work, right? Because that's what we do, right? We are systems oriented people and we are organizers. We are folks who really understand how to garner support. One simple strategy I think that I used that I often tell my students when I'm teaching school social work courses is to identify some of those informal leaders. And of course, leadership is very important. So engaging the leadership and making sure admin are on board and also speaking their language. So sometimes I also remind folks to think about what is important to those people, what is important to administrators, what's the language, how do you translate this into language that they can understand, meaning outcomes, right, that they care about that would be impacted by this work. And so getting them on board, but also identifying informal leaders, right? Teachers that have a lot of influence in schools that other teachers respect, getting them on board. So really identifying kind of who are the potential leaders that could really engage with this work in a collaborative way to get other people then on board and bought into this process. But I guess in general, I think most educators are really concerned about this. They want safe environments for their students and they want safe environments for themselves. And so I think that often it's people already care about this issue. And I think if you need to go another step, it's really about helping them to see how having a safe school and addressing issues of violence in school leads to better academic outcomes. And that's the language that a lot of people do understand, right? Even issues like attendance and things like that and how that translates into those types of other outcomes. And so I think understanding basically what's the language, what do other people need to hear about why this is important. And if you already have folks that do think this is important, then leveraging those people to help collaborate and really move forward with addressing these kinds of issues on a system-wide school level.
That's very interesting. What are some approaches to fostering collaboration between school professionals and community stakeholders in violence prevention initiatives?
Well, there I'm going to again talk about school social workers, right? Because one of the role of school social workers is actually, or a central role of school social workers and what we're known for is being this bridge and being the folks who connect school, community, families, students, right? We are this bridge. And a lot of what we do in schools is exactly that type of outreach and really connecting with community organizations and bringing in those resources into the school setting. So I think school social workers are a really key part of doing that work and building those relationships with community organizations and being able to leverage those resources and bring those resources into the school setting.
Thank you for sharing your insights. To conclude today's podcast episode, can you share with us what resources or training you believe are essential for school professionals to effectively identify and address early signs of violence among students?
I think it is really important to really educate yourself about these kinds of issues. I can send you some resources from school mental health websites where they address issues of violence. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of training. I did a training for the New York public schools where we focused on perpetrators, right, on the youth, because a lot of this violence, particularly racialized violence that target different minoritized groups, it actually is young people, right, between the ages of, say, 16 to 21 that are the main perpetrators often of this type of violence. So it really begins in the schools. And often we think about the victim and working with the people that are impacted by this, but we don't think about other risk factors and why other young people might be involved in being perpetrators. So I think that's an area where we need to do better in terms of talking about how we work with the kids who are at risk of being perpetrators of this violence. But I can definitely share some resources that you can post in any links that you have in the podcast so that folks have some beginning resources where they can look at some of the evidence-based practices and other interventions that are out there related to violence reduction in schools. I definitely have some recommendations.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Dr. Villarreal-Sosa, for joining us today and for your time.
Thank you so much.